Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Talking the Walk, an embodied experience of history. My name is Sammy Marsh, and I am the program coordinator at the Powell Street Festival Society. I'm Hirabayashi, and like many others, I'm a visitor on these lands. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of land, which we each call home. I am currently speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. It is an honor and privilege to learn from and with these communities of these lands and waters. As a settler and newcomer to this land, I strive to deepen my understanding of Indigenous knowledge and teachings. I feel this is an important process which not only shapes my relationship to community, but also helps me to be a better ally to both Indigenous and other marginalized communities. Both within my work at the Powell Street Festival and in my daily life, I commit myself to the struggles against the systems of oppression that have and still dispossess Indigenous peoples of their lands and rights to self-determination. This work is essential to human rights across the world and wherever you are. Please join me in a moment of reflection. Consider the land you are on, and I hope in doing so, we can move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I'm sorry. This series is possible thanks to the financial support from Canada Council for the Arts and BC Arts Council. We sincerely thank all of those who made donations to this event and appreciate your continued support and participation. Some housekeeping notes before we start. We are recording the guest presentations, and these will be available on Powell Street Festival's YouTube channel afterwards. The panelists and speakers will be spotlighted when presenting, so you do not need to change your viewing options. There will be a Q&A portion after the panelist presentations, and at any point during the presentations, we ask that you please write your questions in the chat box. These questions will be shared with our panelists by our guest host, Adiba. Now I'd like to introduce Henry Cheung, the creator of 360 Riot Walk. Henry is an artist and occasional curator whose projects explore the spatial practice of history, language, community, food, and cultural translation in relationship to place. Over to you, Henry.
Hi, thanks. Did I unmute myself? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Sammy and Powell Street Festival and everyone else who has worked on the series of panels. I'm going to be speaking very briefly, well, not too briefly, about how 360 Riot Walk came to be. Can you all see the keynote, PowerPoint? I hope so. Yeah? Okay, cool. Oh, this did not go to the right slide. I'm sorry. Huh. Guess you got to click on that one. There we go. All right. So 360 Riot Walk developed out of Riot Food Here from 2018, which took the form of food offerings along the route taken by the parade organized by the Asiatic Exclusion League in 1907 to demand that Asians be barred from entering Canada. A pop-up dining table that looked as if it had been cobbled together from the debris from a riot offered free food to anyone who would join us. The food tastings were created by Chef Chris Barnholden, and they reflected 5 cuisines that people in the area would have been eating at the time of the riot: European, Chinese, Japanese, Aboriginal, and Punjabi. The meals were eaten and they were accompanied by conversations about what we knew about the city we live in. And reflections were made about how things were back then and how that impacts how things are now. The first site was in front of the Armory across from Cambie Street grounds, now Larwill Park, where the parade began. The second was in front of City Hall, which back then was next to the Carnegie Center, where inflammatory speeches were made within the chambers and relayed to the thousands attending outside, which incited a mob to break out. The third was in the heart of Chinatown, next to the Chinese Classical Garden. And the fourth was at Powell Street Grounds, now Oppenheimer Park, where after 2.5 days of rioting and fighting back by the Chinese and Japanese, and following the general strike by the Chinese that ground the city to a halt, the mayor of Vancouver at the time, Alexander Bethune, was a founding member of Vancouver's Asiatic Exclusion League, attended a public gathering of angry Japanese Canadian community members and addressed their concerns. Riot Food Here launched with a walking tour led by Michael Barnholden, Chris's father, who is the author of Reading the Riot Act, A Brief History of Riots in Vancouver. During his tour, it occurred to me, wouldn't it be great if we could experience Michael's tour whenever we wanted to? And wouldn't it be great if it was an interactive 360 video that one could experience in the exact same locations where the riots had taken place back in 1907? And so Riot Walk was conceived. Riot Walk was my first 360 video project, so there's quite the learning curve. I'd worked with video for many years, but it's a different process when considering how the viewer has more agency in deciding what to look at. Its immersive and interactive qualities provide a more theatrical experience, and it became evident how much more prominent the role of sound was. In this case, the audio track would play. So I teamed up with the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Classical Chinese Garden to apply for funding from the City of Vancouver's Neighborhood Matching Fund, and worked closely with Debbie Jiang and Deanna Chan to present the work. The production was supported by Sean Arden and Maria Lanton at Emily Carr University's Basically Good Media Lab, with Adiba Muzaffar and Ariane Jacobs playing huge roles in the actual making of the digital experience. Partners included the Chinese Canadian Historical Society and the Japanese Language School. 360 Riot Walk launched in the summer of 2019, with first 4 guided tours at the Powell Street Festival and more later at the Sun Yat-sen Garden and Japanese Language School. But it became clear that what we had created was a beta version, or maybe even an alpha version, of what it could be. There were technical aspects I wanted to improve on, and it wasn't until later that I realized that even though you could experience the tour if you had the URL, it wasn't searchable on the internet because it wasn't hosted on a website. So I got funding from Creative BC in partnership with BC Arts Council to do a significant upgrade to the tour and build a website that not only hosts the project, but also includes more resources and content. This was launched last year with a reduced guided tour schedule because of COVID, and a new partnership with Project 1907. And this year, the Powell Street Festival has agreed to take on the stewardship of the project, which is very exciting as it's in so many ways a perfect fit. So for this summer, we'll be offering 5 guided tours, 3 of which will be in Cantonese, Punjabi, and Japanese, although participants can choose any of the 4 languages they wish. Only 10 tickets per tour will be available, so if you're interested, please note when they will be released, as they tend to sell out quickly, especially since they're free. But of course, everyone is welcome to go on the self-guided tour at any time. All you have to do is use your mobile device and check it out from anywhere from your browser. Thank you. So next up is Adiba Muzaffar, who will be moderating today's panel discussions.
Hi, thank you so much, Henry, for bringing us all on the same page. And thank you to all the guest speakers, attendees, and organizers for being here today. I'm Adiba. I'm humbled to be here to moderate this panel titled An Embodied Experience of History. I currently work as a content strategist for a VR art museum called the Museum of Other Realities. I've been associated with the 360 Riot Walk crew since 2019 in a few different ways. Now, from having interviewed several creative technologists for the museum, a common insight about immersive experiences that many seek is an enhancement or blurring of reality. While 360 Riot Walk is a 360 interactive experience, all of its artistic decisions are in an effort to tether the factual past to the factual present, which is my favorite thing about the project, honestly. Being able to station the viewer with historic accuracy in this work is a play on reality using evidence of a city's past. As an immigrant here myself, working on the project was a remarkable way for me to understand the extent of racism, exclusion, and erasure that can exist. In this panel, with our 3 guest speakers, we are eager to discuss this embodied experience of history. As all 3 of our guest speakers have taken the interactive walking tour, titled the 360 Riot Walk, as we know, by Henry Cheung. I think it's important that I introduce our guest speakers. So if you could just have that slide with their bios, and I'll read a bit of their bios for us. Just one second. Yeah, so we have Kathryn A. Bannai. Kathryn is a member of the board of directors of the Little Tokyo Community Council and resides in Los Angeles. She served as a trustee of the Japanese American National Museum, president of the Seattle chapter, and later New York chapter of the JACL, trustee of Eastern Washington University, and chair of the Seattle Public Safety Civil Service Commission. We have Sue Shon. Sue Shon is a PhD and a literary scholar, currently an assistant professor of critical and cultural studies at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. Her investments in multiracial, anti-colonial struggles and solidarities inform and are informed by her research and teaching in critical race and ethnic studies, diasporic aesthetic cultures, and BIPOC cultural production. And we also have Debbie Cheung, who's been part of this project. And she is a creative practitioner with an interest in writing and promoting arts and cultural events. She is the associate editor and a contributing writer of the upcoming art book, Occupying Chinatown. And now I will hand this over to Kathryn A. Bannai to get us started. So thank you, Kathryn, for getting us right into the material now.
Thank you, Adiba. I've been asked to share my experience and thoughts about participating in the walk, especially from my non-local perspective. My initial remarks will relate to my experience in 2019, the value I gained from the walk, and its ties to my personal experience. I would then discuss my appreciation for the walk in light of my work in Los Angeles, Japantown, which is known as Little Tokyo, and share some personal reflections. Pictured on the right is the Vancouver Japanese Language School and Japanese Hall, which is the only example of confiscated property that was returned to Japanese Canadian owners after their exclusion during World War II. It is at the school where the Riot Walk began with an orientation by Henry, who is joined by Adiba and Debbie. You'll notice the iPads and headphones in the photo on the right. The school also has personal significance. I was last there 20 years ago when my school-age son attended Saturday language classes as seen on the photo on the left. And in Little Tokyo, where I reside, I spend time in buildings that have similar histories of forced abandonment due to the removal and exclusion of people of Japanese ancestry during World War II. This was my first experience participating in an interactive video walking tour that utilizes virtual technology. Adopting the terminology of the Riot Walk, it afforded me an embodied experience of the event. Walking through the physical spaces that correspond to historical facts while interacting with the media transported me mentally to an earlier time. I happen to have a basis for limited comparison. Previously, I had seen 2 historic photographs taken in the immediate aftermath of the riot, specifically storefronts with broken windows on Pell Street. This was because 40 years ago this month in Seattle, I viewed the excellent Dream of Riches exhibition that told the story of Japanese Canadians from immigration in 1877 to 1977 through the use of historic photographs and an accompanying written narrative. For me, the Riot Walk's immersive approach brought alive the Japanese Canadians as they prepared for and mounted a robust armed resistance when the rioters reached Japantown. I could better imagine the fear and anger they felt when confronted by the hate-filled riot mob. So for me, while the photographic images and narrative that I had seen decades before were compelling, they were not as impactful as what I experienced while on the Riot Walk. I'll also note that regarding the scope of the Riot Walk, I greatly appreciated that the tour started at the seasonal camp for the Indigenous people that marks the beginning of Vancouver, and then proceeded to build a foundation for understanding the history of anti-Asian violence and white supremacy that culminated in the 1907 riot. My desire to participate in the Riot Walk stemmed in part from my interest in learning how the narratives of racialized communities can be integrated into the rightful place in a nation's story in such a manner that promotes connection and reflection by all people. That interest is also reflected in my volunteer. We are also increasingly reminded of the necessity and urgency of overcoming ignorance about people, so Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and other Asian ancestries. That interest is also reflected in my volunteer work in Little Tokyo, where I serve on the board of the Little Tokyo Community Council, a coalition of stakeholders who strive to protect, preserve, and promote the character and values of our historic community. And I regret that I guess did a poor job here with the image. The image on the left is, you can see sideways, is the notice that was posted in Little Tokyo in 1942 advising Japanese Americans to report for registration at the Japanese Union Church, which was the first step to removal and indefinite incarceration. And at that time, as stated by the US National Park Service, Little Tokyo was a vibrant community of more than 35,000 people, all living within 3 miles of the current Little Tokyo Historic District. Residents of Little Tokyo were forced to abandon their homes and their businesses. The legacy of that exclusion and discrimination continues to adversely impact Little Tokyo and Japanese Americans. After the war, it is estimated by the National Park Service that only 1/3 of the original residents returned to Little Tokyo. Then the physical size of the community diminished due to the construction of a police headquarters building, which demolished 1/4 of Little Tokyo's commercial area, as well as the residences of nearly 1,000 people. Further, urban renewal and community redevelopment also reduced the size of the original commercial district. Today, Little Tokyo faces additional challenges to realizing its vision for a sustainable community due to the pressures such as gentrification, the impact of the housing and homelessness crisis, and development in the adjacent neighborhoods of Civic Center, downtown, and the Arts District. However, notably, Little Tokyo is also a story of resilience. Citing in part from Jonathan Christman's report, Protecting Ibasho, the impact of the arts and culture in Little Tokyo is the largest Japantown in the US. The cultural home to Japanese Americans in Southern California is regarded as a commercial and cultural hub and is a nationally recognized site for Asian American and Pacific Islander arts and cultures. The Japanese Union Church, which I mentioned with respect to the image on the left, the notice that were posted for Japanese Americans to register for removal, is the image now, is the current image on the right. And it is now the Union Center for the Arts, which is home to arts organizations, including East-West Players, the oldest theater company of color in the US, and Visual Communications, the oldest Asian America media arts organization. And on the next slide, on the left is a message from the Little Tokyo Service Center, which conveys the perspective of many Asian Americans. The violence against Asians must be acknowledged as tied to the struggle of a necessity for a social justice reckoning involving Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And standing against anti-Asian racism means standing against all racism. On the right is a quote from the late Gordon Hirabayashi, who is an American civil rights icon and also a Japanese-Canadian professor at the University of Edmonton. As an activist and an educator, Gordon would say that it was imperative that we shine a light onto truth to expose racism. By way of illustration, in 1992, 50 years after he was convicted of crimes on the basis of his race, when he took a principled stand of resistance against the removal and exclusion, incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, he wrote an article that he entitled, 50 Years Later, Where Do We Go From Here? By way of guidance, and as a caution, he stated, racism requires constant energetic vigilance. I applaud Henry for creating the 360 Riot Walk Tour and the Pal Street Festival for taking on its stewardship, thereby advancing the vital cause of shining a light on the truth to expose the historical roots of racism and xenophobia that continues to target individuals of Asian ancestry and their communities in Canada and the US. You can find the sources that I have cited in the resource sharing list. That concludes my remarks. Here now is Sue Shon, who will share her reflections. Sue?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kathryn. Okay. The 360 Riot Walk opens with Indigenous orientation of Vancouver. Here at the village of Lucky, now known as Maple Tree Square, Selena Joseph of Squamish Nation counsels us to walk gently on the shared lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. In the spirit of walking gently, I'd like to reflect on some of the connections the Riot Walk has made for me on the histories and afterlives of settler colonial state racial exclusion, including the making and remaking of borders that mobilize some populations as they demobilize others. I'd been living in Vancouver for a little over 6 months when the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 pandemic and BC declared the COVID-19 public health emergency. Canada closed its borders. As a recent arrivant to Canada under a work visa, I knew that if I left Canada, I would not be let back in. With ambivalence, I started the process of getting a more secure documented status in Canada in case an emergency would require me to leave. Perhaps like many of you, I spent this first pandemic summer enclosed in my home, reckoning with the exponential rise in attacks against Asian people, on anti-Black and racist policing following the murder of George Floyd, and on the explosion of anti-racist, abolitionist uprisings around the world. In September, as quarantine restrictions loosened up, Henry invited me to join a riot walk organized for the Carnegie Community Center. This was my first real opportunity to get acquainted with Chinatown, Pal Street, and the downtown East Side since moving to Vancouver. The group met at Carnegie Community Center, where I had to go get someone to show me the entrance because it was obscured by a long line for breakfast service. After months of being mostly at home, I was more aware than ever how I took up and navigated space, masked and socially distanced. After beginning the tour with headphones in and iPad at hand, I wondered if I looked like a tourist and if I was in the way of other pedestrians. Okay. At the 139 East Hastings stop, we learn about the white supremacist labor riots against sick workers in Bellingham that empowered white supremacist labor and union organizers and other community members in Vancouver to attack Japanese and Chinese workers. Here, Henry pointed out that I might be blocking the entrance to a safe injection site, and I realized that this was my first time learning about safe injection sites too. On our way to Yu Cho Chow's photography studio, a member of our group complained that he couldn't hear the audio over the Chinatown street noise. I guess he got fed up with the noise because he left the group when we were near the last stop of the tour at the Japanese language school. While we were interacting at this stop, a resident of one of the houses on Alexander Street asked us what we were doing, and he and Henry had a chat about the Riot Walk tour. I was experiencing 1907 Chinatown and Powell Street through the lens of global pandemic, anti-Asian confrontations, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous policing, and organized displacement of unhoused people and Indigenous people in the downtown East Side. And I was experiencing today's downtown East Side through the lens of the 1907 Anti-Asian Riots. Walking gently in awareness of my and others' embodied experiences illuminates the clashes and the contingencies of spaces and temporalities. I consider the 360 Riot Walk a space-time warp in the borderlands, which is what activist, writer, and BCCLA Executive Director Harsha Walia calls the downtown East Side. Borderlands is an analytic concept and framework developed by Chicana woman of feminist color theorist Gloria Anzaldúa. Borderlands, as theory, interrogates how state power makes, unmakes, and remakes geographical knowledges about who gets emplaced, displaced, and replaced on the land. I'm interested in how the Riot Walk theorizes and explores the time spaces of borderlands in ways that make it impossible to ignore the crucial role yellow peril plays in the continuum of settler colonialism. In all three settler colonial nation projects in North America, national immigration policy and state border control emerged and were designed to get and keep Asians out. Canada, the United States, and Mexico have all depended to some extent on what literary scholar Aiko Day has identified as a triangulation of symbolic positions that include the native, the alien, and the settler. In her book, Alien Capital, she says, as migrants to North America, Asians' primary relationship to settler colonizers was historically based on labor. Asians represented an alien labor force that mixed with indigenous land to transform it into white property and capital. Day stresses that from the perspective of settler colonial economic anxieties, spatial alienation, or the alienness of Asians on indigenous land is a crucial factor in the exploitation of a racialized labor force. Settler colonial Canada, US, and Mexico, in the global era of slave emancipation and emergence of free wage labor, needed an idea of Asian alienness and threat of yellow peril in order to develop a national economy with cheap Asian labor. Chickasaw literary scholar Jody Bird urges us to move away from understandings of settler colonialism in coeval, causal, and hierarchical terms of colonizer and colonized, and to move towards what she calls cacophony. For Bird, cacophony refers to the horizontal struggles among peoples whose oppressions from the perspective of settler colonialism do not seem related and maybe even in competition with one another. Perhaps the 360 Riot Walk and the practice of walking gently asks us to embrace cacophony. That is, refuse nation narratives of diasporic arrivals and native lived experiences as zero-sum struggles for representation, and instead act on the possibility for an anti-colonial present and decolonized future. Okay, thank you, everyone, and I'll pass things on to Debbie.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sue. And thank you, Adiba, for the introduction. Oh, there I am. Hi. So I'm going to talk about my reflection today. And as Kathryn and Henry mentioned, I've been with this project since the very beginning. I'm just going to start my screen. Can everyone see the screen? Yes, great. So my connection with 360 Riot Walk started long before the first guided tour. I actually saw it come together. So my reflection is mixed with emotions and attachment. When I was working at Dr. Sun Yat-sen Classical Chinese Garden, Henry proposed a project and asked for the garden support in applying for a government grant. After hearing he could create a 360 Riot Walk tour with the help of Emily Carr University, my initial response was, hell yeah, I want to take a VR tour of the 1907 Anti-Asian Riots. One reason I was excited was because of the potential to introduce a tour that could facilitate hard conversation. A large part of my work at the time was related to the tourism industry due to the garden's status as an attraction. Chinatown has been part of Vancouver's destination marketing portfolio for years. The gardens is featured along with char siu, dim sum, and dragon dance, all of the fun things that mainstream or the average tourist would expect. Stories about the neighborhood's struggles, such as gentrification and historic xenophobia and triumphs, are often left to individual businesses and attractions to tell. Chinatown's proximity to the downtown east side also adds an extra layer of complexity. Many out-of-town visitors are shocked by the change after they have passed Hastings streets on their way to the garden. As you can see, the garden is here. This is Hastings, and this part is the downtown east side. So, and during a tourism industry event, a hotel concierge told me he received a complaint from a guest who was infuriated by the recommendation of visiting a garden next to Skid Row. He was expecting something clean and safe, not an area filled with drug addicts and homeless. In the grand scheme of promoting a destination, the community stories of Chinatown and the downtown east side seems too complex to tell, sometimes even at odds with the image of a beautiful, culturally harmonious British Columbia. As such, dealing with the clash between Main Street perception and reality was something I had to deal with on a daily basis at work. Although I knew most of the problems couldn't be solved overnight, and many community organizations were already working hard to raise awareness, I couldn't help but wonder what else could be done. 360 Riot Walk seemed to offer a digital solution that could balance tourism and community engagement. When the English script of 360 Riot Walk was completed, I was amazed by the level of research Henry and his team had done. The 2.5-hour-long tour not only depicts how the riots unfolded, but also includes interesting historical facts about the relevant geographic area. A few moments after the script was completed, the interactive element and audio track finally came together. In this slide, this is the launch back in 2019, and here is Henry giving a talk, and then he's Sean, and then this is the beta version of 360 Riot Walk. So, however, despite how excited I was to experience the digital tour when it was launched, the safety of the in-person experience remained a concern. Most of tour operators avoid the block of Hastings and Main because there is too much risk and liability. You would only see tour buses pass by. It is also a well-known fact that the residents of downtown East Side dislike outsiders taking photos of them. They do not wish to be put on display. A group of people holding up tablets can be easily mistaken for doing exactly that. As you can imagine, I was a little anxious when the first guided tour took place. My senses were heightened as the group walked down to stop number 3 on Hastings from Corral. And sure enough, I saw a few middle finger going up and heard people grumbling, no photos. But thankfully, Mary Lou, the community ambassador, was on the tour to mitigate any issues. She was quick in handing out information, explaining to fellow residents that the group was there to learn the history of the neighborhood, not to take advantage of them. Mary Lou's presence made the group feel more at ease. After all, stepping in and out of the virtual reality zone and while processing new information on unfamiliar BC streets could be a disorientating experience. You don't know what's happening behind you when you have your headphones on. The role of the community ambassador is important in making the guided tour safer and more enjoyable. So throughout my 360 Riot Walk journey, I've learned a lot about the city and country that I immigrated to. The tour made the historical information more accessible and digestible. It gave me a chance to see the downtown east side from a different perspective. I even learned a thing or two from Mary Lou, which I'm very grateful and humble to learn about her neighborhood. I even discovered something new about the Chinese name of Vancouver. In stop number 6 at Pender and Corral, this newspaper clipping you see here, I've learned that the early Cantonese settler called the city Wangawa instead of Wangawa. To non-Cantonese speaker, the character Wan and Wan sound virtually the same. But in Mandarin, the former is sound as Yun and the latter is as Wen. This shows how different the two dialects are and why the Chinese diaspora is so complex. I was so inspired by the discovery that I've started to work on an animated typography piece. So at the end, I think that virtual reality might be the bell and whistle of 360 Riot Walk, but I found the conversations and learning that came from the experience to be just as valuable. And that is all for my short presentation.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you to each of the guest speakers. This was a really wonderful opportunity to hear from your experiences. And I think that maybe before we open this up to the audience, it would be a good idea to see if our guest speakers have any questions for each other.
Adiba?
Yeah.
I have a question for Debbie. The Protecting Ibasho report that I cited examined the impact of the arts and culture in Little Tokyo. It states that survey results showed that as Little Tokyo changes over time, and even as its stakeholders become less Japanese American, its identity as a Japanese American place remains important, and future development ought to respect and protect its heritage. From your experience, I wonder if you think that that would hold true for Vancouver's Chinatown. That is, even as stakeholders become less Chinese Canadian, there exists a sentiment that its identity as a Chinese Canadian place remains important, and that future development ought to respect and protect its heritage.
Yes, I think, hi. Yes, I think that, I think as the neighborhood, as the neighborhood changes, the heritage, the cultural heritage, rather we have, at the moment, there's the buildings and then the physical heritage sides of things. But as the community protects the cultural heritage that is that you cannot see, basically, it will continue on. And I think that the community is working hard on making sure that happens. Although we are seeing some issues at the moment because of COVID, the neighborhood is suffering, but then again, the neighborhood is very resilient. I think that it will come back and then and we'll work together to make it happen.
Thank you.
Did any of the other guest speakers want to raise a question for one of the other guest speakers?
I have a question for Kathryn, actually. So you have been working on, I saw your bio, you have been working on been involved in most of the racial injustice that racialized community experience. And we have come, do you think that we've come a long way since that you have got involved in the topic?
You know, I think that what we've learned over time is that what's really necessary is to end structural and social racism against all people. And so from that standpoint, although we've seen progress, like in the US in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act, which sought to address structural and institutional inequities and discrimination against Black Americans and other minorities, that in fact, what has been, I think, recognized over, especially since the recent reckoning, that I think, and I think what particularly galvanized people was the murder of George Floyd. And so a recognition that, in fact, it's important here in the United States that we go back to the roots of slavery and our history and the structural institutional racism. And so there is a bill before Congress, the House of Representatives, to establish a commission to do a study and to examine reparations for Black Americans. And so I think that while there's been some significant progress in terms of legislation, and we see that there have been promulgations from President Biden. You know, we've seen what's happened in the last year with respect to Black Lives Matter, the need for, and I think the person who and there have been people who are far more qualified than I am to make these statements, but one statement that resonated with me was Professor Scott Kudashiga talks about the need to think and act in transformative ways, and that we need to understand what we experience as systemic, and it requires solidarity with others if we want change. And so while I think that there's it needs to be recognized that there's been some progress, I think that there's a lot more progress yet to be made and change.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question and that answer, Debbie and Kathryn. Sue, did you have a question?
Not a direct question, but maybe I'm impressed or, by the two takeaways that I kind of just want to point out, and maybe they'll generate, a seg into a conversation. But the first is that the 360 Riot Walk as an immersive embodied experience is really all about using the five senses. And I'm really excited to hear Henry's setup, learning that it was a food tour, but I think the 360, learning about the context of the Riot Walk and how all three of us experienced it is so much about maybe not understanding, but like situating yourself in your body, in this space, in this time, realizing that it takes all five senses, or maybe even more senses than that to do so. So I loved hearing from Henry, Debbie, and Kathryn about what makes something immersive. So that's one thing I think that's gonna stay with me. And then another point is, Kathryn kind of spoke to it a bit, but to think about and understand and always be ready to revise what it means to be in community and what your community is. Because that's going to inform and shape and redefine what solidarity practices are and what they can be. So I'm really excited about that thread that's emerging across all of our little talks today.
Thank you, Sue. And in fact, I was very taken by the way you brought in walking gently in your presentation, because I think it touches upon some of the things you just said, and also essentially becomes part of what is immersion and how does it become effective. So I was curious if there are artistic decisions that the tour has taken which you think are successful or could have been different that you wanted to tell us about. I guess this is a question for Sue still. So I'm curious.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Sorry. So yeah, if you want me to reframe it, I guess because a lot of the attendees might have an experience of the tour, which is not an actual physical tour, but just maybe the web browser tour. And you were speaking from your experience of the actual tangibility of each of those things, which could be counted as obstacles or not. So that's why I thought it would be interesting to ask you if you think there are certain artistic decisions which are successful or could have been different in the way the tour has been designed.
You know, I actually took the 360 tour before, during the pandemic. I think I just did it. Or no, actually I did it when I first arrived in Vancouver. But like I had nothing to anchor me because I don't think I'd really been to Chinatown yet or the area. I think the last time I was there was actually before I moved to Vancouver, when I was looking for apartments to move into. And I remember taking it, but I guess that's how I felt. Like I felt very like a little bit like removed from it. And I think, that was part of the experience for me. I was like, okay, once I actually get to know that neighborhood better, I'll have I'll be able to appreciate differently what the Riot tour was like. But at the same time, I did think both, in the virtual experience, like on my computer at home, and, the physical embodied immersive experience in the downtown East Side, I was thinking about the, anti-Asian, what I do know in other cities I've lived in the United States, what I know about anti-Asian activism, right? In Seattle, I lived in Seattle for a long time. So I was thinking about, well, this is actually what, this is a pattern, right? Across the settler colonial nations of North America. So I guess in that way, I guess I did have that anchor, even though, even through the virtual experience, I was kind of thinking, oh, I mean, this does look a little bit like, Seattle's International District. This looks a little bit like New York's Chinatown, right? And then learning about this kind of anti-Asian activism, I mean, it's a pattern. And it's striking in that way, even if you're not taking the virtual, if you're taking it virtually. I think it's striking because it allows you to think about the patterns that you already know and figure out how Vancouver fits in.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks for taking my question. I think we also have a question from Ala Girasik, who's in the audience. The question can be answered either by Henry or Dr. Shon, so maybe both. How can insights gained from 360 Riot Walk and its portrait of settler xenophobia sparked by alien, Asian, unwaged or low-waged labor help us understand contemporary narratives about alien, Asian real estate investors and speculation? Are these narratives related, or is something distinctly different at play?
Well, they're both, the comparables both speak to fear and paranoia, but the more recent example has to do more with capital and the fear of so-called aliens, in this case Asians, who are not considered normative, or maybe not white enough, they're seen as a threat, different kind of threat, an economic threat. Now, the different kind of economic threat of the cheap labor that was being brought in 19th century I guess more or less starting with the railroad and then mining and all the other kind of stuff after that. That was also an economic threat, but that was the cheap labor threat. But it's really difficult to be able to clearly focus on what the different issues are within that one topic of contemporary discourse, perhaps histrionic discourse around land values and housing costs, because to bring up the topic of Asian capital investing in real estate here, this part of the world, or other parts of the world, can you really separate it from the history of racism against Asians? And if you are able to really separate that, then yeah, we can have a fulsome conversation. But if you can't, then that's where it gets all muddied. And someone like Andy Yan has done a lot of research and work around it, and he's been attacked for that research. Maybe it helps that he's Chinese to be able to look at the people through their last names of who's bought property and owns property in Greater Vancouver. Andy's the director of SFU's city program, by the way. And, you know, that's just one amongst many pieces of the puzzle in terms of the people who've invested money in this area. If you look at big investors from the beginning of Vancouver as an incorporation, well, a lot of British money, a lot of American money, and a lot of Irish money, right? The Guinness family and British properties. And they built the first Narrows Bridge, right? And it used to be a toll bridge until they paid it off and then sold it to the city because it was costing too much to repair. So all these subtleties, they're all connected, and it's really hard to disassociate to just simply talk about Asian real estate investors, because there's a lot. And Andy talks about how it's disproportionate, the number of ethnically Chinese landowners in Vancouver specifically. And that says, you know, from a Chinese perspective, it makes sense that Chinese want to own land. It's a cultural thing as well, if they possibly can. The sacrifices that people make to own land, yeah, there's all these cultural specificities, but can we actually have a conversation and not be racist about it? That's the challenge.
Thanks, Henry. If nobody else wants to add to it, I have another question from the attendees. Did anyone else want to? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit. I mean, Henry's absolutely right that actually the very idea of capital has always been racialized, especially in this emergence of a global capitalism, right? Like, so it's a conversation about the inseparability, like the racialization of capital, right? So I think that it's a great conversation to have. A lot of scholars have done excellent work on it. The literary scholar that I cited, Aiko Day, the title of her book is Alien Capital. So she is kind of looking at the alien labor capacity, how that's actually a representation of capital. So I'm not going to get too deep into this because it's going to sound like school. But I think it's the large question is, I mean, it's a big question about racial capitalism and how and all capitalism is racial capitalism, how that moved from industrial colonialist capitalism, right? Like, so that's the original moment of mass Asian migrations. So that the 360 Riot Walk is exploring. What's happened since then to this period of, let's say, Vancouver feeling threatened by Asian capital, like, right, real estate investors and speculation, as Allah says. What's happened in between, a lot has happened in between, right? Like we are now in a financialized global capitalism, and actually racialization, Asian racialization is a crucial component in all of the, in that continuum, in that these shifts towards, you know, questions of late capitalism. So just a little bit about that.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Sue, not Sean. We have another question from the attendees, but I'm not sure who this is addressed to. But again, anybody from the guest speakers, or if Henry wants to pitch in. Alistair Butcher has asked, I'm interested in strategies of engagement with the local community to reduce hostility towards walking tours. How can we spread awareness that these are educational exercises rather than voyeuristic or extractive practices?
I can answer that. I can speak to that for a little bit. It takes a lot of groundwork. It's when you're in the community, then you know different organizations and you have to be in that zone. You can't just create a tour out of the blue and then go walk down the streets because that would be a little bit uncomfortable. And that's exactly what's with 360 Riot Walk and the more commercial tours, that's the difference. So it really depends on how the tour is designed. Maybe people will be surprised, but there are actually quite, as far as I know, like there's like at least like 20 or 30 tour operators doing tours in Chinatown alone, coming in and out. And even recently with the rise of Airbnb, those Airbnb experience is very unique. And it's not necessarily run by a company, but more like self-employed individuals who knows the community. And I have seen, because with the situation of the garden, and I'm referring to it, one side of it, it's you have to pay an admission to go in. The other side, it's free and it's run by the park board. So the number of tours that I've seen in the park area were way more than the garden. It's because anyone with some knowledge of Vancouver history can come to the garden and points out, oh, like there is this garden that was built by artisan from China in the 80s, and it has been here for 30 something years. So I think that's the danger of, and that's the tricky balance. Like you have something that's visual and it's basically a monument. And then there's the stories of the people for like the gentrification and a lot of those things. It really depends on the tour operator if they wanted to go into those stories. So the ones that I've seen that are really good and wanted the community to respect them and to accept them, and it's actually go to like the different organizations and businesses and actually work with them and come up with a solution. And in terms of you spreading awareness, and it has to it has to start with from the ground level. Then when you do the promotional side of things and be very careful of what you share, that's another thing that I will totally watch out for.
Thanks, Debbie. And if I could add to that question, I guess maybe from a marketing perspective, considering you've also been working on the promotion of the tours, what do you find are things that people require from the marketing side to be demystified about this part of the city and this part of history?
Well, you know what? It's actually kind of interesting since social media. Because I found that on your own channel, you can talk a lot about personal stories or stories of the community. And since the George Floyd incident, I have to say that I've seen more stories from destination marketing organization like Destination BC and Tourism Vancouver. Like things have improve a little bit. Hence, I asked Kathryn the question earlier, like, how far do you think that we've come? But in terms of this, the word demystifying, it's also a little bit tricky, because the people have been in that neighborhood for a very long time. They don't see themselves as aliens. They don't see themselves, they're part of their residents. So in a way, what they do is just what they do everyday life. It's like me eating lunch. Why do I need to demystify that? So that's also something that is a lot of people, like, how do we get to those questions? And in the promotional side of things, it's also, I think it's like the more that we put out, it will help the conversation. And then just getting the people there. And I think the Chinatown community is doing their best to get people there and to make it lively.
Thank you, Debbie. Another question I had was essentially around if any of you feel that there's something that the tour was able to say about the present with that immersion into the past. What might you think is one of your favorite or most rich takeaways about that present that it brings to light?
Can I share my screen really quick to answer this question? So I'm gonna do share screen again. So this kind of connects to Alistair's question too, and Debbie's rumination. So, okay, so this is the 139 East Hastings stop, and I mean, I remember this well because I was in the way. I was like in front of that door. You see that door that's kind of open, and Henry's like, "Oh, okay, this is a safe injection site," and I'm like, "Oh, okay, let me get out of the way," right? And it made me be really aware of the space-time warp, right? Like what this 360 Riot Tour is teaching me. Okay, while I was preparing this presentation, I took a screen capture. I was really able to look at this. I mean, I hope you're seeing what I'm seeing. Do you see the pole that's right in the middle? And then there's a figure hiding behind it. And this blows my mind. I want to think about this, like, and I'm curious, Adiba, maybe it was you that was filmed this portion, or maybe Henry. So to Alistair's question and to Adiba, your last question about like what it says about, the present and how what is space in the present? What does it mean to be immersed in this neighborhood and in 1907? I cannot help but, think about this figure who does not want to be seen, right? Or I don't know, or actually, I don't know if that's what's happening here. Okay, I'll stop share. Everybody got a good look.
That's a really interesting question, because the way the 360 equipment works is that if you are using the equipment, you will be around it. So Arian and we were working on taking these photos and then editing these photos. So it's probably one of us, because we did have to hide. But even though what you're actually asking, the larger question that you're asking, it's still relevant, because that was the stop that we had to go to multiple times, simply because it was a difficult stop to capture without also bringing in somebody in that space, injecting themselves with a substance or in a pretty pitiable state, which, we also were very conscious of, and were not sure if those are elements which we want to add in the picture version of the tour, when as it is, people who will take the tour will experience that. And yeah, like if you look at that frame, it's also interestingly evident that the camera is actually on the road. It's not on the street itself. And we were followed. We were even asked questions. There was a person who followed us into a thrift store, because that's where we tried to like flee beyond a point, and they started taking pictures of us. And beyond a point, we were like, that's fair. I mean, if we're going and taking pictures of spaces which they consider home and invading that privacy. And we had little printouts to explain to people that this is a project, but with some people, those printouts were not really useful. Like, what do you take from that? So I remember that that has happened. So I think overall, it was interesting that there are these immersive components that come not just from the tour, but the streets it makes you go on. And yeah, like maybe part of your question is also coming from just those kinds of obstacles, which I think are great as actually almost like incidental moments or parts of the present in one sense, rather than part of the past. And that's why the whole flipping of color, where the images are in black and white and the archival images are in color, also kind of hint at that, which is again another of those artistic decisions which challenge that emotion. I think we have, or no, we don't. Sorry, I thought that was a new question. Yeah, I think, sorry.
I think there's one more question in the chat.
Oh, there is, yes. All right, so this is a question from Sissy, who is asking, pushing Alistair's question further, perhaps a question for Henry and the production team. Would you share those engagements with the DTES community that aim beyond reducing hostility toward this 360 Riot Walk? How does sharing place bridge past and present and enable future reconciliation across political, cultural, as well as socio-economic divides?
Well, I can try to address that to an extent. Big question. So the walking tour geographically doesn't cover that much territory. I mean, it's longer because we start at Lukluki in Gastown, and then we go to Chinatown, and then up to Powell Street. So you know, and it doesn't actually follow the parade and the demonstration from downtown Vancouver, because that would actually be way too far. That's a larger geographic space. But just in those few blocks for this walking tour, you move through radically different communities, right? I mean, the first one, you start off in Tourism Central.
Yep.
And that part around the Gassy Jack Memorial Statue, controversial as it may be, would be a place where people coming off the cruise ships probably would see, you know, and on the way, that dumb clock with the steam. But they might not go much further than that. If they do decide to keep going, then they're going to probably have to encounter East Hastings on their way to Chinatown, if they want to go to Chinatown. Then those people probably wouldn't go to Powell Street, because it's not going to be their destination, not likely. And there's reasons for that, historic reasons, right? Really significant reasons. So each of these areas have their own specific histories, and the reasons for having the tour go through these sites is not just because they're trying to follow the path. That's a really big part of it, but we could have skipped it. We could easily have skipped the areas that might make some people uncomfortable, because a lot of people skip those spaces anyways, right? People who are not comfortable in the areas, people who don't know anything about that area, or they've heard that it's not a good place to go, they actively skip that area. But it's so important to be able to address why that area is the way it is. And and just to physically be there and just to spend that time there, hopefully we'll do more than just, you know, clock in a few minutes, but actually raise some questions, and raise some questions about why things are the way they are now, because there are always reasons, always. So, and those four communities are integrally tied together, and yet they're so, oftentimes people don't cross that line, that one street. They won't go that one block over. So how can we reconcile that? The only way you can really begin to reconcile that is to consider all of those spaces to be normal. And if you can consider, and if we can work towards making these spaces normative, in that they all exist, not in a hierarchy, but next to each other, because they are physically next to each other, only then can you actually see the relationships and the connections and the and that you yourself are also on the same plane as all those four places. So not just any one of them. And that's the issue around one of the issues around the idea of community. That you can identify with one and then not identify with others. Okay, I'm done.
Can I add a little bit to what Henry said? Henry mentioned about he and the team could easily take out the area that it's most people don't go to on, for example, stop number 3. And I think that was the point that when he proposed the project, of course, it was just this general idea of doing a 360 Riot Walk of the 1907 Anti-Asian Riots. He didn't tell me there's like specific stops. And when he was explaining it to me, the importance of normalizing all the hierarchy of these spaces. And because when I was working at the Garden as communication and marketing manager, I always find that I have to tweak my stories to fit that model, to fit that tourism model so that I could sell some tickets. So that is, it's, in a way, I feel that I wasn't true to myself and I wasn't true to the community. And I got a chance to meet a lot of people in the industry, and some are understanding, some are really good, but a lot of them are more interested, like Henry was saying, people from like getting off the cruise ship. And from time to time, you do get visitors that are very well educated and they're interested in the topic. And I have people coming in asking me a question about downtown East Side because they pass Hastings to go to the Garden, and they're genuinely understanding. Like they're not there to criticize. They were just asking me questions. And at that point, I felt that I didn't know enough about downtown East Side. So when Henry proposed the project and talk about it, we have to include that. It's just, that's history. That's the way it is. And I totally understand that. And even though that there was a huge concern with insurance and liability when Henry said that it has to go through that, although of course that got people a little bit antsy, but we did it anyways. And it was because of, and the reason why I mentioned Mary Lou, the community ambassador, it was just very important to have something like that around to help us understand how the neighborhood is like. And the fact that I think that being actively involved, just getting yourself out there and see what it's like makes a big difference. And I think we still have a lot of work to do in terms of balancing in that hierarchy of the geographical neighborhood. I'm just wondering if COVID would change that. Like, could we start it? Because as you can see, Guest Town right now, although restrictions are opening, but Guest Town is not like what it's used to be. And I think it gives them a taste of what it's like for the other neighborhoods.
Speaking of neighborhoods, considering one other decision which was made around the same part of the tour was the ambassadors. So I was curious if either of you wanted to share anything about that process of first coming up with the idea of ambassadors, how they came to be called ambassadors, and how you found them.
Yeah, well, that would be Emmy Morita. She suggested it because, well, we live together, and we talk about what we're working on, and it was a concern, like what people are going to get upset when we walk through some of these areas more than others, and then Amy came up with the idea of going to talk to Downtown East Side Works and Embers and trying to hire somebody to come along with us on the tour and basically be a public liaison for anybody who is on the street and is wondering what we're doing, or perhaps who is jumping to the conclusion based on pretty obvious evidence of having an iPad aimed at you that you're having your picture taken and being upset about that. So and we experienced that with Riot Food here, because for those events, I asked people to take pictures to document the event, and there were times when someone came up and said, "Hey, you take a picture of me," and they have to show them the pictures that you took, and said, "No, you're not there. Oh, you're way in the background. Okay, I'll delete this." So that's a matter of respect. Even though you're outside in a public space and all that, if people get upset, you have to do something about it. So yeah, so it was Emmy's idea, and it's become a significant part of the experience. And depending on who the local ambassador is, they can play a real significant role, but also for the tour participants, if they're not familiar with that area, having a local who knows lots of people from that area, and just having them part of your experience, again, helps normalize things, and that's so important.
I think Kathryn has a question.
It's actually not a question, just a remark from my experience on the Riot Walk. I don't know if it was Mary Lou who was the ambassador when I took the tour, which was the first tour. I guess Henry's nodding his head, but I actually kind of, she was kind of at the back of the tour, and I was watching her kind of engage with different people in the neighborhood. And so I kind of hung back and I asked her if she'd be willing to chat with me, as long as it didn't take away from her other responsibilities. And she was really open, because I was really interested in finding out about people who were residing in the SROs, people who were using the services in the neighborhood. And she was really welcoming and informative. And one of the reasons I was interested in going to the Pastry Festival that year was because the Pastry Festival on principle had decided not to hold it, the festival in Oppenheimer Park, in deference to and respect for the unhoused people in the park who are calling it home. And I come from Little Tokyo, where one of our adjacent neighborhoods is Skid Row, which I think in the last count had maybe about 4,800 or 5,500 unhoused people. It's a major humanitarian crisis. And so I was really interested about, that decision by the Pastry Festival. I was also interested that one of the panels for the Pastry Festival that same weekend was Right to Remain, which is the effort made by individuals in the unhoused community to remain in the community. So for me, it was really extraordinary having an opportunity to be able to interact with the ambassador. It was integral to the value. I only had 8 minutes to talk, so that was one thing I didn't cite, but that was certainly an important part of my experience. And when we got back to the classroom at the language school, she motioned me over, and she said, "I want you to," we had been talking about the container housing that had come up in the neighborhood. And so she motioned me over and she said, "You can look down over there and you'll see, 2 of the containers that are being used as residences for formerly unhoused persons." So I do think that was, I really hope that, I'm glad to hear that it's something that is a feature of the ongoing program.
Thank you for that, Kathryn. This is really valuable also, because I think that level of inclusion feels more real when they're also given a chance to take pride in what they're showing you, and it's not necessarily pride, but it's at least a sense of ownership. And I think that also comes through because of them being part of the tour with us. And I really look forward to more ambassadors in the upcoming tours. So we're at 3:20, which leaves us with 10 minutes. I just wanted to make sure that more attendees don't have any questions that they wanted to share in the chat before we move on. Okay, in that case, we could bring this to a close. I'd really like to thank everyone who took the time out on this Saturday afternoon to come and attend this. Thank you to the guest speakers. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to Henry and PSF also for just helping organize these panel series. I will just announce some of the dates, which if you'd like to note or you'd like to know more about are available on the 360 Riot Walk website. So the next panel will be on June 19th, which is titled The Complexity and Nuance of Cultural Translation, which is with the 360 Riot Walk translators. And on July 10th, we have a talk titled What's at Stake with the 360 Riot Walk contributing writers. And all of the guided tours that have already been scheduled, which were also mentioned in the comments, the dates for those are July 24th, July 25th, 31st, and August 1st, and then one more on September 11th. All of this information will be also available on our social media. And with that said, I'd like to now bring this event to a close. We truly appreciate the time that everyone took out and for this very fruitful discussion. Henry, did you have any closing remarks?
Thanks for coming.
I think there's all sorts of thanking happening in the chat.
That's it. Yeah. Okay. Bye all.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, and everyone have a great evening. And we could keep this conversation going on our promotional channels if you'd like. Thank you.
Thank you.